Hello, everybody, and welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. Today, we are going to talk about money. We're going to talk about money with Patrick Murray, professor of philosophy at Creighton University, author of The Mismeasure of Wealth, Marx's Theory of Wissenschaft, and two new books that are coming out of essays. One is called let's see, the consequences of I've got it right here. Okay, all those acknowledgments in the introduction of philosophical and political consequences of the critique of political economy, recognizing capital. I love the subtitle here. And the other one is called False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, I think. Anyway, but most famous for The Mismeasure of Wealth, and which is out from first from Brill and then from Haymarket in the Historical Materialism series. We have Beverley Beth, the Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University, who is the author of Marx and the Dynamic of Capital Formation, and a new book that's coming out from Verso called The Automatic Fetish, which we will be discussing later in the month, even live in Seattle if you're here. And last of all, Samuel Chambers, Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University, and the author of many books, Bearing Society in Mind, Capitalist Economics, There's No Such Thing as the Economy, and the book that brings us all here today, which is called Money Has No Value. So Samuel, I don't know if you know it, but when I put your name, oh, great, I should show the thing. You know, when I put your name up to find your exact title at the university on Google, the first name that came up under Samuel when I wrote it was Samuel Alito. Anyway, Samuel Alito will never be at Red May, but Samuel Chambers, hopefully he'll be at a lot. So Sam, start by telling us about money, and then we might as well jump into this head on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. That gets us rolling. I, I was saying before we went on live here that I had an initial plan to write a book about money that was going to be short. I wanted to kind of get money out of the way and do one of these new shorter monographs of 25 to 30,000 words that works out a theory of money. And this book is evidence of my complete failure because it ended up coming in around 120,000 words, I think. And given that, it would be futile and probably a bit stultifying for me to try to summarize the arguments of this relatively long book in 10 minutes or so. But I also think it would be a waste of our valuable time, all of us gathered here in one virtual spot with an opportunity for dialogue and conversation, for me to use up all that time in a long presentation. So instead of trying to make the arguments, I'd like to just say a few words about how I came to write the book and what I think the stakes might be of a theory of money, which is a way of trying to express why I think concepts, histories, theories of money should be absolutely central to the questions, concerns, and goals of the Red May community in the audience here. So this book has a simple origin story. I came to write it not because I had a grand political vision to outline or defend. While I think politics is central to this project, there's very little defense of any political positions or principles in the book. And I didn't write it because I had intellectual battles to be won against other academic enemies. In fact, this book is comprised of less critique than maybe any book I've written. It mainly cites others as aids to understanding, as intellectual allies, and there are a lot of people I learned so much from that I wouldn't have been close to capable of producing something like an alternative theory money. And I also didn't write it because I thought that the work would be a bestseller. I mean, obviously it won't. So really, this was a book that was just truly a work of self-clarification. I'm trying to explain money here because I find money just insanely confusing and complex and difficult to grasp. And I stumbled into the money quicksand myself over the course of about a decade of teaching and research in classical and contemporary political economy, studying the analysis and critique of capitalism, and especially Marx. And I think for many people, including myself, in the early stages of study of these topics, it's easy to avoid the money question because so many authors, including great authors, will provide you with helpful detours around money. So if you read volume 1 of Capital, you come to chapter 3 with the heading money, and in the first sentence, Marx says, I assume that gold is the money commodity. Ah, so money's gold. Okay, done. Totally alternative, different trajectory example. If you read someone like Randall Wray, one of the founders of modern money theory, you'll encounter the simple notion that money is currency issued by a state. All dollars are issued by the federal government. So again, right, money is just paper money. The state issues it and everyone else holds and spends it. Simple. And of course, if you stick with any sort of superficial understanding of economics, confine yourself to the abstract model articulated by the neoclassical paradigm, then you can just exclude money entirely from your study of political economy. This is what all those econ textbooks do. They tell us that a quote unquote real economy can be modeled as a barter like exchange of commodities, and money doesn't enter into it. Now, we know that that is all just dead wrong, and we've known it for a really long time. There is no trans-historical economy. There are instead social orders, societies. They are situated in time and place, and they are structured by economic forces and relations. And I would want to argue that depending on where they're situated in time and place, they're structured by radically different, incommensurable economic forces and relations. So if we want to make sense out of capitalist social orders, which is where I would confine myself here and largely in this theory of money, then we have to see that they're arranged really very strangely. In those orders, goods are produced according to the logic of capital. That is, goods are produced not to be consumed by the individuals who produce them, nor to be distributed according to a logic of direct need or power. Instead, goods are produced in order to be sold for money so as to attain a profit that can then be used to produce more goods, to sell for more money, to realize more profit. This all means that a capitalist social order is a money society. Money is constitutive here. And more than this, I think if we dig deeper into this strange process that Marx described as values self-valorization, we see that the most important forms of value under capitalism are the commodity form and the money form. So a different way of describing capitalism would be to say that capital continually substitutes money for commodities and commodities for money. Value can only self-valorize by recurrently changing form in this way. All of this, I think, makes money absolutely essential because money must be very much like commodities. Money and commodities are both forms of value under capitalism, but it also has to be definitely distinct. To understand the capital societies we live in, we need to understand both commodities and money. And to put this next point really far too simply, I think that while we have some amazing resources in the history of economic thought for grasping the nature of commodities, especially for me, Marx, we find a relative dearth of good systematic sources for understanding money. And I think most importantly, once you really set your sights on making sense out of money, once you ignore those detour signs put up by political economists that tell us to just assume money is X, Y, or Z, once you dig into money, that's the moment that for me, it becomes a totally confusing and contradictory mess. One of the hardest things I think to understand in contemporary society in the logic of capital and in capitalist social orders. So I think a good theory of money has to do some justice to the complexity of money, and perhaps that's a backhanded justification for the fact that my book ended up taking 5 times as many words as I'd hoped it would. But I think the dominant theories of money today, commodity theory and chartalism, are both reductive in a way that just isn't inadequate to understanding capitalist societies. So my theory is providing a clear and concise conceptual apparatus for making sense of the nature of money, but I hope it's one that also allows us to build from there in order to go on to make sense of what Marx called the dazzling money form. So having said all that as background, briefly before I hand off the metaphorical microphone, a few placeholders, particularly for viewers who haven't looked at anything I've said about money to have reference to what that basic apparatus is. I would describe it really briefly as follows. I reject all of metallism and commodity theory. Money is not a commodity, and the second part is really important. It never has been a commodity. I also reject the simple alternatives, whether they come in the form of a sociological account in which money has value because everyone agrees it has value. This has made a comeback in the last 10 years, that money is just this kind of shared group fiction or delusion that we just assume this these pieces of paper have value. I reject that alternative as overly simplistic, but also the neo-chartalist account in which money has value because the state declares that it does. I think it's very important to think about the relationship between state power and money and economic forces and relations, but they can't be as simple as reducing the theory of money to declaration by the state. So if we want a simple guide to grasping money, I think the best bet is actually to begin with bank money. And one way of overly crudely summarizing my theory of money is to say that money, kind of in its nature, is bank money. To elaborate, money is an economic relation of credit and debt. It's always both sides. You can't have credit without debt. You can't have debt without credit. They're correlative. This is always important to remember. I think there are theories of credit money that forget the debt part. So whenever I say credit, I mean credit/debt. So money is an economic relation of credit and debt. And therefore, what it means to hold money is to hold a valid claim, that's a credit, on a viable debtor. This means that money can be created at any time that two agents, whether they be individuals or institutions, swap IOUs. If I was going to do visuals here, I decided to make this technically simple, but this would be the point that I put up the sheet that you can Google and find many examples of, which is the balance sheet visualization of what happens when a bank makes a loan to a customer. At a single moment in time, both the bank's balance sheet and the customer balance sheet get two entities created on it, an asset and a liability. For the bank, the loan they've made to the customer is their asset. That's counterintuitive for many, but I think it's absolutely central that banks' assets are the loans they make. The liability of the bank is the deposit account, which becomes the asset of the customer, and the liability of the customer is the loan. And at this moment of time, before this moment, these assets and liabilities don't exist at all. Then they both appear on the balance sheet. Let's say the loan's for $10,000. There's now $10,000 of money in the world that didn't exist before. That is the nature of money, this coming into being almost out of nothing, but not out of nothing, because what's now been created is a credit debt relation. So that if I'm that loan customer and I now have $10,000 in my deposit account because I've taken out a loan, when I go to write a check and spend it, I'm calling on that relationship to my bank, who in the sense of my writing the check is my debtor. They owe me that $10,000 and I write that check to someone else to pass it off. That is the kind of boiled down essence of money. I've tried to expand this insight into what I call the money array, which is a simplified way of grasping the nature of money. For me, there are always and must be four necessary elements for there to be money. And those four items are the money token, any kind of claim or ticket or contract, digital entries on a spreadsheet that represents the relationship and the link between the creditor and debtor. The token is the first thing. Second is the creditor, which is just whoever's holding on to this token, who possesses it, who has title to it. Third is the debtor, the party on whom the token makes a claim. And fourth, a kind of slippery but also intuitive concept in some ways, is denomination, which is that credit debt has to be specified in two ways. It has to be named in some sort of money of account, euros, rupees, francs, and there has to be a quantity to it. That's denomination. So the money array is token, creditor, debtor, and denomination. I think this starting point allows us to perhaps succeed where other theories fail. First of all, by distinguishing money from not money. With this idea of the money array, we can look at lots of things that people have wanted to call money and that economics functionalist accounts of money would call money, and see why they're not money. And in turn, I think we can do something essential to understanding capitalism and possibly developing a critique of capitalism, which is that we can distinguish money from commodities. And I'll close with this. In distinguishing money from commodities, there's two angles. One comes straight from my theory of the money array. Commodities have no debtor, and they are not denominated. If I hold a barrel of oil in my hand, it's not a claim on someone else. There's no debtor. And the oil can be measured in quantity. It can be a barrel or X number of gallons, but it doesn't have denomination in that the oil itself is not money denomination. Of course, commodities are priced, but that is in money terms, which is a very different thing. Second angle here is just to say that commodities are twofold in their nature. That is, they are both use value and exchange value. But money is not twofold. Money is exchange value become independent. And that's a quote from Marx. So the money array, the theory of money I build, lets us see the difference between money and commodities, which I think is part of what we need to do in order to understand the mutual substitution of money for commodities in the self-valorization of value that is capitalism. Now, I don't think a theory of money is the magical solution to unravel capitalism, either by fixing it or by destroying it. But I think that to be armed with a better theory of money is to be much better prepared to navigate our current and future paths through our capitalist societies. Thanks.
Okay. Shall I speak? Yeah. Thank you, Sam, and thank you for this terrific book. It's great reading. It's obviously the product of a tremendous amount of work and thought on your part, and we're all indebted to you. So, what is it that money doesn't have? Well, that's kind of a smart alecky way of saying what is value, and there are a few things that, as I'm reading the book, strike me as missing, and I want to just maybe call attention to some of those, and really discussion of value head on is one of them. Maybe more on that. What is value? Seems to me like that's one of the most fundamental questions that we face, and the question of, and I don't think it can be answered apart from the question that you're dealing with in the book. What is money? Marx's view is that money is the necessary form of appearance of value, and so they're linked at the hip there. One of the distinctions that you have and spend some time on is real analysis and in distinction from monetary approach. And you do something very interesting with that I want to say something about. So real analysis, which I think has really been the mainstream, which I would almost identify with economics, is caught in what I would call the illusion of the economic. Real analysis is a way of approaching social life minus all of its constitutive social forms and purposes, as if there was something like the economy in general, which in an earlier book you titled "There's No Such Thing as the Economy." I quite agree. And so I think for me, one of the lessons of your book is, real, so-called real analysis. I would regard the whole project as based on a pseudo concept. It's as if real analysis thought that its object of inquiry was an economy in general, but there is no such thing, can be no such thing, and therefore doesn't really, I would just say broadly, economics doesn't have an object of inquiry, and that's a big problem. Now, what you do something with the contrast between those two, the real and the monetary, and you say that's A and B, and then you introduce C, which is really based on the idea that money is real. But I think that's problematic in this regard. I think you're trying to I don't know, say something not as harsh as I think needs to be said, which is, so you say there's a kind of a possibility of saying real analysis is really just bogus. It's nothing. Or you can say money is real. But if you say money is real, it seems to me that's equivocating, because the whole point of the real in real analysis was precisely to bracket socially specific phenomena like money. So I have a problem with that. I think that there's not really an option. I think you just have to say real analysis is bogus. I notice there's very little about polarity between the commodity and money. So Marx, when he discusses the value form, one of the key features of the value form is its polarity, so that the commodity whose value is being expressed is in the relative value form, it's expressed in the equivalent value form, and that money is in the equivalent value form. So there's very little on the idea of a universal money as a universal equivalent, it seems to me, until I think the discussion of liquidity really gets us into that. Okay, that the idea that money is liquid, meaning that it will always circulate. And you point out, well, that's not really the case. And this is part, as I understand it, of your case for breaking down a barrier that a lot of theorists have between credit and money. And you want to defend the idea of credit is money. But why not? Why couldn't you say this? In fact, I think this is what Marx would say. I think in a way it's what you say also in other places, that if money stops being liquid, if it stops circulating, then it just stops being money. Okay, so in other words, the fact that something's functioning as money is not a guarantee. In other words, read it. There's no guarantee that it can always function as money. And you have very interesting things to say about barter. Really saying that barter is something that exists only in monetary economies, which is kind of surprising and amusing, but I think probably right. And really, it's when money breaks down, and then when money breaks down, then it seems to me you lose what you were just talking about as the fourth element in the array. You lose the dimension, and so it seems to me, in that case, from your own by your own lights, so to speak, that maybe we'd have to say what's happening here is that we just don't have money. In which case, maybe we don't really need to take away the distinction between credit and money. Couple things. I won't go too much longer. How to understand inflation? If money has no value, how do we understand inflation or deflation? That's one question. How do we understand Marx's idea of the money fetish if money has no value? It seems to me that the whole idea of money as a fetish is that it has this strange thing of value. So I don't know. There's a lot of things I found very interesting, that the couple episodes, one with Jevons, who's defending a purely subjective, right? So the idea of intrinsic value for a value subjectivist like Jevons or Samuel Bailey before him, intrinsic value is fetishistic. Nothing has any value, right? So money has no value. Nothing from a subjective value theorist, nothing has any value of any sort, use value or whatever else you might mean by value or exchange, right? And then you have a very interesting discussion of how Jevons, in my view, just sort of is tying himself up in knots as a result of that. Then closer to home is an episode with Schumpeter, where he wants to say what you say about money is not value, but then he wants to say it's a type of power and purchasing power. But that has nothing to do with the question of value. I'm inclined to think it has everything to do with the question of value. And then he wants to go on and basically think of money as a ticket. But I don't think that works at all. I mean, Marx calls attention to the difference between time chits or labor money, the Proudhonist, and Ricardian socialist idea, and what he associates with tickets. He said those are not tickets. Robert Owen has a kind of ticket idea. I mean, a ticket, money, I don't think can be thought of as a ticket. It doesn't catch up with the universal equivalent. The fact that it's passed on. Schumpeter's talking about a theater ticket. Once I've used my theater ticket, that's ripped up. If I buy something, the person who I buy from doesn't rip up the bill. So I don't quite that, but I think if you don't have things quite right, then you get into trouble. I'll close with some questions about the very main thesis in the title, whether or not doesn't money have a use value as in all of its functions? Isn't that useful in a capitalist society in all of those functions? And I also wonder whether or not it isn't a value in Marx's sense of value, although very weird, because the value would not be really related to its non-social useful qualities, or wouldn't have any relationship to the labor used to produce whatever is the money stuff. But that would, I think, allow keeping that thought alive would allow us, I think, maybe to talk about inflation, deflation, the money fetish. Well, there's a lot. There's so much more in the book, and it's terrific. So, thank you.
Hi. I'm going to assume that everything's working and the mic is working, and okay, good. Yes. Okay, good. Well, thank you to Philip, and thanks all the Red May organizers and Stephen, Sean, and Mayhem, and everybody, all the other organizers about whom I don't know. And Sam, congratulations on the book. Again, I'll just reiterate, obviously a tremendous amount of work went into preparing this. And you're right, you could start thinking you're going to write a short book on money, and it's not possible. And thanks for inviting me to have a conversation with everyone about it. One reason why I accepted that invitation, and before I'd read the book, is because I am a great admirer of your book on value. There's no such thing as The Economy, which came out in 2018. And, and a little bit selfishly, because I'm trying to do that as well, which is write a book about money, but from a Marxian perspective, which I'm going to refer to as a value theory of money. And as Patrick mentions the question of value, the first thing that struck me upon reading the book is what an interesting choice you made in inviting your interlocutors about this book. So for me, it was almost the first question I would want to ask is, because it seems to be the pink elephant in the room, is you've asked two researchers, both of whom I know you know, and we know you know, and work with Marx's critique of political economy. But this is definitely not a book or a theory of money, or your credit theory of money is definitely not a Marxian theory of money. So it was interesting to me that I would be curious to know more. I was both curious and interested to know more about your invitation to invite a Marxian perspective onto the book, or even potentially to invite a Marxian intervention or a value theory intervention into the analysis. So you got one from Patrick, and here would be my version. Unfortunately, because, and I hope that's what you're looking for, because that's all I can give you, because unlike Patrick, I can't say much about, other than to map, people like the thinkers with whom you build this theory. Ingham, Innes, Ray, to a certain extent, Schumpeter and Keynes, and some other neoclassical thinkers. But I can't do that. I can only give you a conversation from the point of view of Marx's value theory of money. But it also struck me how many initial agreements I think there are between what would be a Marxian value theory of money and the theory of money that you're building here. And I'm going to call them surface agreements. I think they're only nominal agreements. I think once we start unpacking any of them, the departure in perspective makes itself really clear and evident. But just to give you a sense of how many agreements we could start off with, and I won't list them all, but you say we need a fundamental reversal of the everyday understanding of money. Agreed. Money is not a thing. It is a relation or a social relation. Agree. Money is a relation that is bound up with power and enforceable by violence and coercion. Agree. Money relation takes hybrid forms, or many different hybrid forms: economic, political, cultural. Agreed. Money is valueless. That is a complex. Initially, agree, but then it gets very much more complicated, I think, as we go on, and there's a more kind of, I would work with a more dialectical sense of money as both a value form, valueless when it steps into the role of universal equivalent, but must be a definite magnitude of value in order to step into the role where it sheds its own role as a congealed, or as the monetary, or a congealed magnitude of socially necessary labor time, and so on. Money is real, or the monetary is real, as you say. Agreed. And certainly we agree that Bitcoin is not money, but interestingly, again, for different reasons. But I think, I could pick any one of those. And I think maybe there was 3 quick points that I wanted to make. I'll see if I can get through, how quickly I can get through them. I might just save 1 or 2. But if we start with something like money is a social relation, in your theory, that social relation is one between creditors and debtors, and banks as a mediator of that, or as the issuer and keeper of money of account, the token, or the denominated token. But from a Marxian point of view, or from a value theory of money, to locate and to personify the source or the basis of the movement of money with the social relation of creditors and debtors, in a way, is to fetishize the inverted appearances of another social relation that has to be the basis of that one from that point of view, which is the social relation of production. So if we think of, credit, how is it possible? What do creditors and debtors presuppose? For Marx, it presupposes a very particular production scenario. In fact, Marx's theory of money is really just a cipher for an entire mode of production. So that, for instance, money presupposes, if money is the form of appearance of a certain magnitude of congealed, socially necessary labor time, well, how is that possible? That's possible because of a long history of separation that finds the bulk of humanity separated from all means of subsistence, and therefore rendered propertyless, and with no other means to survive other than to sell their the only thing that they have, which is their power, their capacity to labor. So the labor, collectivized labor and socialized labor produces the social product. The social product, however, in capitalist terms, conform to the logic of private property. So what money is for Marx in this analysis is the scar tissue of that history of separation. It's the way that social wealth itself, which is the product of those separated from the means of production, money is the way in which that socialized product can become the private property of, a small portion of humanity that finds itself in the position or as the bearer of the capitalist class. So the relationship between creditor and debtor for Marx is like the froth on the ocean. And what's missing from that model is the rest of the ocean, which is a very specific relation of production that emerges from a certain history, and money becomes the outward face of that history. And it's and what's so important about that is that money in Marx's analysis, and I think it works, it's true up to this moment, because for Marx, this is going to be the case. Once this very particular history that renders most people propertyless, and Marx says from that moment, you have an entire new world history unfurls from there. And money is the way that carries on into the present and to this very moment. So for Marx, for example, money activates and engages that history of separation at every one of its moments, to this moment, to this day. And I think that still is the case. And I think the explanatory power of that is enormous and still underestimated, because I think that that analysis itself is still animates and activates money, and it can explain things that it explains. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to go on to point 2 and 3 because it took me so long to do number 1, and I hope to come back to number 2. But what that also means is that money is a way to if money is the form of appearance of socialized labor, which constitutes the total social product, right? So money is the outward face of the entirety of social wealth. But because money must come apart from value and its form of appearance and money must separate, that understanding why social wealth must take the body, must be incarnated in something else. And for Marx, that's the commodity that steps into the role of universal equivalence and then functions as money. That coming apart between value and money, which is the same thing as saying the possibility of value in the product, the value of the commodity comes apart from its price. For Marx, that coming apart is the very possibility of the emergence of a capitalist society altogether. It must come apart. You cannot, a society that develops as an expression of a complex division of labor, generalized exchange, where the products of production are exchanged as the product of private enterprise, must take the form of this polarity of the commodity as a polarity between value, a polarized duality of value on the one hand and money on the other, because that's the very possibility of capitalism emerging at all, because that's how the process of equalization takes place, through price coming apart from value. But it's also the source of its dysfunction, specifically because credit is not money. So this is another interesting thing. What Marx would say, not only is money not credit, even though credit money can circulate like money. The very heart of Marx's critique of money and by extension capital is that false appearance of credit like money, because credit, the entire system hinges on the production of surplus value. And the distinction between valorization in the sphere of production and then realization and circulation hinges both on value and money coming apart, but it's also the source of capital potentially breaking down. So that breakdown is the source of crisis, volatility, and all the human terms the human terms of capital breaking down. Okay, we could come back to some of those things. Yes, please, we need to go to the whole panel, and I'm sorry. I got caught in trying to say, in that moment of trying to explain anything and not figuring out how to be able to do that without first explaining everything.
Thank you, everyone. Terrific, lots to think about. Maybe Sam can respond. Sam, maybe you arrange this dialectically, putting kind of value form theorists against the theory of money that you were outlining, which I believe was more the theory of money that's implied by the people who actually do business, as opposed to the one written by microeconomic economists and so forth, so, but maybe you'd like to respond to what Bev said and what Patrick said.
I'll try to be succinct. I can't, what Bev laid out, would love to talk about for another hour, but we don't have that. So I'll just maybe put some placeholders down for future conversations that me and Bev and Patrick might have, but also that would orient questions and discussions from other people out there. And maybe the way to start there is for me to re-narrate what's up in this book, because I think, so I should say, I've got about 40,000 words of Marx on money, a 25,000 word draft of I don't know what 25,000 words is. It was an article at one point, and then it got way too long, and it's not a book, and then a bunch of other stuff, particularly on. I've got a big chunk of stuff. Maybe I'll follow up with you, to Patrick, to talk about that, specifically on polarity, on the different accountings in volume 1, where we have first the forms of value, but then we have the poles of value. These multiple dimensions, I think there's a way in which we kind of all know them, but also a way in which people haven't thought them through. The difference between so Rubin calls it the difference between the value expression and the value equation, where the value equation assumes that if we have X commodity A equals Y commodity B, they must be equal values because the equality sign posits them as such. But then in the expression, it's not really an equal sign. When we say that 3 books equals 1 coat, the polarity is expressed because we know that there's a difference between 3 books equals 1 coat and 1 coat equals 3 books, because what's in the second category changes. I think a lot of readers of Marx, panelists excluded, gloss over that too quickly. And that's the dialectical tension, that it's one thing to say, we can express the exchange value of this mug in this AirPod case, and a completely different thing to exchange. We can express this AirPods case exchange value in the use value body of the mug. I think that's crucial. I think what Bev ended with is really important for me. The necessary potential of the coming apart. It links to what Patrick said about if money doesn't circulate, it's not money. I agree completely. I also think that when money doesn't circulate, it's not credit either. It's just the extreme form of a crisis. We are reduced back to commodities and their use values, not their exchange values. We would be, I think I have a line in the book, because much of it was written in the pandemic, that what's the most liquid thing in April of 2020? toilet paper. We couldn't get enough of it, so everyone wanted to buy a lot of it. And so in a way, the liquid thing there becomes money. Keynes talked at one point about houses being liquid. That is, when you have a money crisis and credits don't circulate as money, then the retreat to value will be retreat to value of a commodity, which is twofold. And this is the fundamental failure of all of marginalism, and therefore all of neoclassical economics, is that the strictly relative theory of value suggests that we can posit that the entirety of value of a commodity is subjective preferences or needs or desires or demands for it in a microeconomic model. My reading of Marx, not all readers of Marx share this, but I think that when Marx says the commodity is twofold, he's making a deeply ontological claim about the nature of commodities under capitalism. So this is a historically circumscribed ontology. It's not a transhistorical metaphysical truth. But I think when he says that the commodity is twofold, he means not that there's this thing and it has these two properties, use value and exchange value. He's saying a commodity is a use value and it is an exchange value. And I believe that, and this is Rubin's reading, that when he says a commodity is a use value, I had a long multi-year conversation with a PhD student over, if you have a shovel, the use value of the shovel is digging. My argument would be through Marx is that the shovel's digging use value is in the nature of the shovel. If you don't need a shovel right now, Phil, your subjective marginalist preference for it is zero. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a use value. It just means you don't want to buy it, but it still has a use value. Money, in this sense, this is one response to Patrick, doesn't have a use value. I think it's very different from saying a thing has a use value in the way Marx describes it as the nature of a commodity as twofold, than to say things have use or we use them. So I think we have all sorts of social techniques and social practices and technologies that are useful and we use them. But there are things that are useful and we use that do not have, in what for me is a technical sense, a use value. And so, and I guess this is also, I was going to say more about this, but just very briefly, I couldn't have written this book without Marx's insights into value and the value form and the nature of the commodity. There are hundreds of places throughout the book where I'm hiding the Marx, because this book, the project of this book was, it's too long already. If I tried to engage with the Marx, it would be 200,000 words and no one would ever read it. So my confession, Marx is intentionally excluded here. You all found some of the footnotes that were there. You know, the barter footnote, where I had what I thought was a pretty cool reading of Capital Volume 1, in which I see that it's only in Marx's analysis of the value form that we actually see the very potential for barter. That's also a Graeber-like point about the fact that historically we've only ever bartered in monetary societies, but I think it's a deeper point in Marx that like the very nature of barter only emerges under capitalism. So you all saw those footnotes, but there's 100 other places where the insights I gained from Marx were excluded. So the potential for money ceasing to function, the potential for value disappearing, the fact that in a crisis you have a bunch of unemployed labor and a bunch of unused commodities that can't be sold and money not circulating and value is destroyed is a deep insight that we see in the finance world, but is skipped in all of economics and a lot of political economy. And that's driving me along the way. Part of what I also think at this point, and I hope, Bev, that your book will prove me wrong and take the analysis to a place that it hasn't gotten, but I failed to write a Marxist theory of money project. And it's because ultimately, I think that, first of all, I don't think Marx ever intended to write a theory of money. I think he had amazing insights on money, some of the most important insights on money, and lots of ideas on money, and that in theorizing the commodity as deeply as he had to, he said a lot of very important things about money. But I think ultimately he didn't develop a theory, and that I think if we look comprehensively about what he says about money, I think it is incoherent. I think it's just, there are contradictions that are not dialectically resolved. I think he just says some things that are actually incompatible with what he thinks. I think that some of the stuff on fictitious capital is incompatible with other things that Marx says, where he understands that value is a value projection for the future, that capitalist production is engaged in anticipation of the realization of value, and that the anticipation of the realization of value dialectically informs the beginning of the production process, and that Marx therefore deeply understands value as a future-oriented entity. So when he then says credit isn't real value because it's just a claim on commodities in the present, i.e. gold, I think that's incompatible. I also think that what he says about the gold mining industry is pedagogically illustrative for him making some important arguments about value. But Marx wants to argue for value equations where when the gold mining industry digs gold out of the ground, as it comes out, it is money. I think that is historically just completely untenable in a way that Marx himself totally understood when he was studying what was going on in London. You have to take the gold to the mint. And I should say here, part of what is excluded from this book, but it's at the core of that 25,000 words, are two places in Marx. The passages in the Grundrisse that I think a lot of people know because they know the Grundrisse well, but some passages in the Urtext that I think are crucial. Marx says, it's Marx who says that money is exchange value become independent. In the Urtext and the Grundrisse, it has these places where he clearly shows the separation between money and a commodity, that if one can reconcile them with the theory of the universal equivalent, it will take a lot of work, because Marx says that, this is a quote, gold and silver cease to be commodities when they circulate as money. One can try to reconcile that, but I ultimately came to the conclusion that we do better to read Marx for his brilliant understanding of capitalism, of the value form, and of the nature of the commodity. And that if we try to derive from him a theory of money, I think the best that it can do is explain how money works within Marx's overall project. But I'm not sure what we do with it to engage with facts like gold has never been money as a commodity, that commodity gold and money gold are different entities and they can never be the same. There are places in the Grundrisse and the Urtext where Marx himself is saying that. But we also know there are places within Capital when he seems to be suggesting that commodity gold is money. Just one footnote here, because I should let other people talk. The universal equivalent, I'm basically just giving you my notes for this project I didn't complete. The universal equivalent is crucial. And I think that the universal equivalent is not a theory of money. For one thing, as everybody probably knows, but I think some readers of Marx don't, that's not his concept. It's an older concept that he resignifies. I think he's using universal equivalent to show us the value form and to explain his theory of commodity. The term comes up mainly in the chapters on commodities, not on money. So I think there's always been a shorthand in the literature on Marx to say, what's money in Marx? It's the universal equivalent. No, I think the universal equivalent is a separate concept to understand value and the value form. And that when Marx actually talks about money directly, and he only really talks about the universal equivalent in volume 1, when he talks about money in other places, it doesn't show up there. So I think, I guess that would be the task for the Marx's theory of money, is to make that compatible with other elements that I didn't think could be. Maybe some of that touches on, this is completely inadequate to the amazing list of questions, but I guess I just want to say, my hope and aim is that the theory of money I have here can be folded back in to Marx's value theory of capitalism. That is what I would intend it to do. And there's only a couple of places where it pushes really hard against Marx. One, Bev articulated. If we think that credit and money are fundamentally different, that money has value because it's in the body of a commodity that is a use value and exchange value, and credit is just a future claim, that is untenable with my theory. That is a friction point. But I think there are dozens of places in Marx where he actually affirms that. And I actually think that the theory of the value form affirms that. Money is the necessary form that value takes, and money can be a claim he sees in lots of other places. Patrick, I just want to say one thing so I don't forget, which is that your critique of Schumpeter on ticket, I've never read that. I've never seen that. And I think that is exactly right. That the type of claim that we have when we call money a money claim, or the type of token that money is, should not be confused with a theater ticket. Schumpeter does equate it with a theater ticket, and it persists in the literature because of that. But you are 100% correct. We tear up the theater ticket when we hand it over. When we hand over money, that person holds onto it and plans to hand it over again. So that is a huge limitation there. I don't think it undermines the idea that the money relation between creditor and debtor is symbolized by some token, but the nature of that token is a circulating token, not a ticket that we rip in two. That's very helpful. I'd like to say things about inflation and deflation, but they would take forever. I just want to say quickly that the idea that money has value and we can therefore come up with the quantity theory of money. I think almost all theories of inflation and deflation are traced back to a quantity theory of money, where we know that if there's more money, we get inflation. If there's less money, we get deflation, and that's because money has value. We must throw that out because empirically that is false. And then we have to start someplace else, which means we have to think about interest rates as power relations. We have to think about the fact that sometimes money claims can expand dramatically, like they did between 2009 and 2012 when the money supply increased fourfold and we had no inflation, or what happened between 2021 and 2022 when we did have inflation. It's too simplistic, but I think those things are about constrained supply much more than they are about, like, money supply is not a thing, I don't think, even though that's the fundamental concept. It would be, your critique of quasi-concepts and faux concepts, I think, would go straight to money supply. And just briefly there on real monetary, I don't think money is real instead of monetary. I think that Schumpeter's distinction is helpful for mapping the history of theories of money, but that ultimately we have to deconstruct the real monetary. So when I say money is real, that is a Derridian rhetorical device to say, I'm going to pick neither side of the dichotomy by naming the thing that is supposed to be at the bottom and putting it on the top. But the next step has to be an explosion of it, which I think comes later in the book. But in that chapter, I'm kind of, I guess one could argue, stuck in Schumpeter's framework. But I wanted some framework to give people a map, because there's a thing this book is doing that I think fewer people are interested in, and I get that. But I wanted it to be a place that people could go to say, what does the history of theories of money look like? Because I spent a few years before I even decided to try to write this book, because I thought Ingham's book was the best and we didn't need another. And I think Ingham's overall theory of money is still fantastic, but his limitation was more on those history of theories.
Bev and Patrick, you want to respond? Patrick, unmute yourself. Unmute thyself.
Done. Okay, sorry. One of the things that I think is really a fundamental insight of Marx, and you see it in the Grundrissub, I mean, he devotes a chapter at the end of volume 3, is the inseparability of production and distribution. So I would just call attention to that fundamental concept as underlying Bev's discussion of production. Yeah, I mean, the reason we have money is because of the social form of labor we have in a capitalist society. I think that's Marx's view. So, as I understand it, barter. I really appreciated the things you had to say and how you drew on Graeber on barter, but I guess I have an even more fundamental, I think, problem with barter, is that what are you exchanging? And this is also a problem. You sometimes represent barter as CC. I've noticed Marx, I found one place where he has CC. I think that may probably be a mistake because they're not commodities. And other places, it's very clear that they're use values. But here's the problem. So if barter is exchanging use values, problem with that is there are no simple use values. So in other words, the core of historical materialism is that you always have a social form and specific social forms and purposes for wealth and labor and production. So the whole idea of barter imagines that you have wealth without any social form. So to me, that makes barter just a complete non-starter. I think there's other considerations about that too, but I would just put that one in there. I'll pause there.
I mean, I think that's your argument there. I take to mean, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that you can't just exchange use values, because if you're prior to a capitalist social order, you don't actually even have commodities as twofold entities that are use value and exchange value. I agree entirely. I think that what you're doing in barter, C can't actually equal C. You simply have, and Ingham actually has a really nice line on this, where you do the math of what it would require to actually have a barter system, and the way you would make use values equal use values. It's completely impossible. It does an exponential math. I mean, one can choose to engage in a swap, but there would be no equal sign there, right? There would just be, I'm going to hand this over and you're going to hand this over, but that doesn't in any way indicate that these things are equal. So I think the fuller version, which I just hint at in a footnote in the book, but the fuller argument that I would want to make around this would be that the very idea that C could equal C is an idea we get from a capitalist social order. It's only from within the terms of the general formula for capitalist production, in which it seems like these things are being equated, and they're not being equated, they're being spiraled up through a system of production. It's only in that world that you could look at these things and go, oh, they're equal. They're never actually equal. Even when they're posited in relation to one another, there is this fundamental inequality. Rancière has this line in the one place where he was still a Marxist, where he calls it the impossible equation, which I have stolen and used a lot, because we have to see that when we put that equal sign between them, they can't actually be equal. And I think Rubin is really good on this in sort of saying the difference between the expression and the equation. And I also have a long, ridiculous footnote where I think about other ways of expressing these relations. I think that algebraic linearity identity principles are really distorting for those of us who've been reading Marx for centuries now, right? That we see these posited equalities and they're not equalities.
I think that's something that Rancière might have gotten from Marx by way of Shakespeare. I think Marx quotes Shakespeare exactly on that, and of course Aristotle would be completely behind that. And that, I mean, that this could get us off into a whole discussion of utility as a pseudo concept that is so rooted, I call it a shadow concept of value and capital, and it's, I think, so destructive of social theory, the role it plays. But Sam, it's not just that I want to say they're not commodities and that they're not commensurable in the way you just described. What I want to say is that the concept of barter posits useful things as use values in general. In other words, you made the point well before about the ontological character. So the ontological character of use values is, you point out that calling them, describing them as a commodity is an ontological. I completely agree. But what my point is that if you don't have, if the commodity is not the social form of wealth, then it's got to have some other social form. And that's ontological. And that's why I think barter is bogus, because it posits useful things as if they were just useful wealth in general.
I think it's my turn. I'll respond briefly about one of the points, Sam, that you made about Marx, but I'm also cognizant that this is not supposed to be a panel about Marx. It's supposed to be a panel about your book. And so I'm going to try to finish with this one point quickly, and then bring it back around to your book and ask you some questions directly about how you, from your theory, would articulate certain things. One of the reasons why production in Marx's value theory of money, production and distribution cannot be, or just two dialectical sides of the same coin, is because valorization takes place in production, but new value. So Marx is interested, what makes capital a system unlike any before in history? And that's accumulation. That's because wealth expands. It's a historically new wealth, social wealth of social content, social wealth, abstract wealth, that has never existed before, and it expands. And so Marx is trying to figure out how that expansion happens, and he calls accumulation. So we know, and I'm assuming many in the Red May audience know how valorization takes place in production, but realization of value doesn't take place until circulation. So that product, the value and the new value, including the surplus value that is congealed in the social product, has to be purchased before that value can be realized. And that happens in circulation. So for Marx, the reason why money and credit money, why it's crucial to make a distinction between them and not to collapse them, is because only money can realize the value in the social product. Credit money, so the commodity we know is one pole, its money form, which it needs to meet with, and in order to be realized, I make a commodity, I send it out into the marketplace, and it, as Marx says, commodities are in love with money, but the course of true love never runs smoothly. So commodities go out into the market and search for their other half. And sometimes they find their other half, and sometimes they don't find their other half. But if they don't find the other half, then the value and the surplus value congealed in the product cannot be realized. And Marx says, okay, now credit, which can, on the surface of things, function like money and keep the system going and turning over to a certain extent, cannot realize the value. What credit does when credit steps in to do the work that only money really can do is that it punts realization down the road. And until the point where money can step in and complete and kind of consummate that love affair. But the piling up, and this I'm trying to bring about to the question of inflation, because as we see, as capital starts to break down and the system breaks down and more credit is pumped into the system in order to keep it doing just the everyday things that capital needs to do to hold itself together. And more credit comes to complete the circulation, the process of circulation. Marx says, well, that is also the source of the system's fragility. And this is how it starts to break down, because it's as if it's a game of musical chairs. The commodities the music is playing, only money can function as the chairs, and everybody starts to sit down. But the more credit you pump into the system, the more states rely on credit to cover the business of running a state, and so on and so forth. It's as though you're adding more and more players to the game of musical chairs without increasing the number of chairs. So you've got 11 players to 10 chairs, and as you pump more credit, you've got 12 players to 10 chairs, and 13 players to 10 chairs, and 14 players, and 15 players. And the more and more credit you pump into the system, when the music stops, the more value exists in the system that can't be realized. That's inflation, right? That's another way of describing that, is from the surface story of inflation. But Marx says, don't mistake inflation for something that's really happening underneath the surface. In fact, the quantity theory of money that has its way of explaining inflation is just the surface story of what's really going on underneath. And that's a story of value and the movement of value. But accumulation, just to come back, that's what's not in this theory of money. So for Marx, accumulation, a theory of money, and we do disagree about how far you can go with that. And I might be on the far end of the spectrum with thinking just how much ground you can cover with Marx's theory of money. I do think it actually does all of it. And I'm going to give it a shot. I'll give it a whirl. I don't know, it might not work, but where does it get? So to bring it around back to your book and your theory of money, how do we think about accumulation? Because there's no accumulation. How does a credit, I've just described the way in which for Marx, you couldn't have a credit theory of money and explain accumulation. But that's pretty important if you're trying to kind of talk about how a capitalist system works. There's no interest. So from your book, it's as if nobody makes money through credit. Credit for Marx is a way that a portion of the total social surplus value is redistributed back to those who own money. And again, the social relation at the heart of that theory is one between buyers and sellers, and that is another way of saying between those who own, those who produce social wealth, and those who own social wealth as their private property. That's the relation that's at the heart of it in that case. But with creditors and debtors, where's the role? Where how are people making money, or how are those who own? And can I tack on to that question, if it comes back to you, Sam, like how do you personify, how would you describe the personification of debtors and creditors? Because if we just look at what I think of as the kind of surface story of creditors and debtors, when Concordia deposits my paycheck in the bank, at different moments, I'm a creditor and a debtor, right? So, but Marx wants to say, no, there's that social relation where anyone can be a creditor and anyone can be a debtor, that rests on what Marx says, not everyone is an owner of social wealth and a producer of social wealth. In fact, that relationship, which is more fundamental, is mystified by the fact that anyone, whether or not you're an owner of the means of production or whether you have been separated from the means of your subsistence and survival, can be a creditor, is in one moment a creditor and in one moment a debtor. So, what I'm saying about the question about personifying the creditors and debtors is also a question about how do you analyze this as a relationship of power. As you say, this is a power relationship, and it is one that's based on coercion and violence. But that's not really explicitly, that point is not explicitly made in terms of really who's getting the short end of the stick here and who's not. Because certainly, if anything, when it comes to talking about the credit system, my goodness, a really small number of people are coming out very, 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 very well, and most of the people are the bulk of humanity are not. But I don't see how we can explain that just with the creditor-debtor array and the bank array. Okay, over to you.
So I think probably the most important clarifying comment there is that I'm not producing a theory of the capitalist social order. I'm producing a theory of money within the terms of a capitalist social order. And I don't think a theory of money is going to explain society. I think that we have to understand money within the terms of a particular society. Now, so in that sense, I don't think a theory of money is a fairly narrow and limited thing. And if one wants to explain a capitalist social order, one needs a whole lot more components. One needs a theory of production, distribution, and exchange and consumption. And one probably needs a theory, if it's a capitalist social order, a theory of value. And that's why I do, perhaps it's too brief, but I do situate early on in the book. I basically say, look, there are feudal societies and tributary societies and capitalist societies, and they have different systems of production. And I'm mainly interested in this book in describing money in terms of a capitalist society, and it has a system of production that looks like this, which means it's a process of value self-valorization, which is another way of thinking about something called accumulation. I want to say something about accumulation, but before I get to that, because it may be more helpful, we do disagree. Everything you laid out about valorization in production and realization in exchange, I'm completely on board with. The idea that value can only be realized in exchange if it's realized in exchange for commodity money that is money, not credit, I think is incompatible with Marx's time and our time. The realization of value, the capitalist starts with, I will start with money, start a production process. In the production process, there will be, as we know from Marx, value produced, including surplus value through the production process. And it will take us from our raw materials of C to our finished goods of C prime. And then we must realize that value on the market in exchange for M, which is M prime. And I think that M prime takes the form of credits. I think that someone gets a check from a bank, and it is a claim on a debtor. I don't think that we realize value through the realization of goods on the other end or commodities. Now, there's a different angle to this, which is to say, what is exactly that the capitalist is realizing when they realize value? And this gets to the accumulation. I mean, what do Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have? Lots and lots and lots of zeros on their bank account. They have debtors who owe them money credits, and there are lots and lots of zeros. Do they also have more stuff than us? Yes, but I think I have a line in the book. You can only have so many yachts. I mean, Jeff Bezos has more money than I do, and that is a form of accumulation. But if we erased all bank accounts to zero, if we said there's no more credit and debt, no one owes anything tomorrow, then no one would owe Jeff Bezos. And all of his money is the US government, stocks, and banks owing him money. The difference between us in terms of equality of accumulation, he would now have some more yachts, but he wouldn't have any money credits to buy fuel or pay people to work on them. So his yacht wouldn't even do him any good. He might have a slightly bigger house than I would. So I think, for me, accumulation is obviously important in our understanding of capital, but crisis in which value is destroyed in dramatic degree is also important. Sometimes that value destruction can simply be the zeros in a bank account. Often when you destroy the zeros in a bank account, you also interrupt production processes, throw people into unemployment, and there's gigantic human suffering involved, but not always. But value destruction is at the heart of that. I also think that's also why you alluded toward a crisis, and I think a crisis, if we've had too much expansion, value has been valorized such that we're increasing more and more value, and we cannot keep up at those growth levels. And then we have a crisis. That's deflation, not inflation.
Let me step in here with a question.
Go ahead. Yes, please do.
I want to direct it more again towards what you actually did in the book, which I think is absolutely novel. And that is getting to the notion of what businessmen, what people actually do in a world where, for example, capital markets are different than money markets, and money markets have become exponentially more important, and yet that's not sort of acknowledged in the theories of how we take it together. I think the problem is one might divide bourgeois economics from like the critique of political economy, but the other factor is there's what businessmen are actually doing or think they're doing, what they're doing behind their back, and what academic economics say they're doing. There are essentially three factors here. And what you're exploring is the gulf between the academic, the utopia of someone goes to market, someone else goes with a commodity, everybody gets what they want by definition or so forth. Every company can easily switch to another line of business when they go out of business with no turnover and so forth. And what you're trying to elaborate a little is on the mystery of money to some degree, which is certainly inadequately developed in bourgeois theory. Take the bill of exchange. The concept of moneyness, for example, is one that you encounter occasionally in people like Merlin. The bill of exchange is originally something between two people. It's a piece of paper. It's nothing. But the way it suddenly gets accepted outside that, until in the end a bank will accept it, brings to mind Minsky's comment that anybody can be a bank and anybody can issue money. The question is getting other people to take it. And so this whole process where something that was not originally money becomes money is part of the mystery that has to be solved. Because one of the proposals to dealing with the financial crisis and shadow banks, where someone said, look, they're all listed as cash equivalents, all this stuff on balance sheets. all we have to do is make them money, give these banks the ability to issue money legally, and then suddenly we don't have a problem with liquidity anymore. I mean, crazy ideas like that are coming out that asks someone like you to sort of take all this and see how the way of capitalism is evolving in the way that Marx in 1857 or whatever said, I can't finish this yet. I want to see how this crisis comes out. I see you in that same position and implicitly saying, we've looked at the ontology of capitalism. We understand that capitalism has to keep accumulating or it will die. If there's no MCM prime, it can't be capitalism. So all these ideas about, steady state capitalism are just non-starters. But what is it actually doing now as it evolves, seemingly every 5 or 10 years, not in its essence or in its ontology, but in its empirical nature, which affects a lot. So I think that's where your book is placed in the beginning. Now, it's important that eventually this dialectic between what Patrick is ever writing and what you're writing takes place. I mean, that's a fruitful area for part 2 of Money Has No Value. But in terms of we have to be the Marx who theories of surplus value and really take notes on how these things are functioning now in the capitalist world. That's my defense of your book.
Well, I would just add there as a footnote that maybe bridges to Bev's discussion earlier. I mean, the debates over the origins of capitalism are incredibly complicated and detailed and historically fraught, and there are many, many sources. I take a kind of combination of Jairus Banerjee and Ellen Wood as combining elements that are crucial, which means I think that the early emergence of merchant capitalism was not capitalist production in one country, but it was a kind of capitalist use of markets, and that it was a necessary precondition to the emergence of capitalism in England through the revolution of capitalist food production in the 16th century. So I kind of like to tie them together. And an element one can add to tying them together is that merchant capitalism isn't possible without the Bill of Exchange. And interestingly, the Bill of Exchange in the 14th century is way more complicated than the Bill of Exchange in 19th century England, where you were just accepting bills on bankers. The Bill of Exchange in the 14th century has multiple parties and multiple currencies, and it functions fundamentally as a derivative, which means that one of the necessary source points and drivers of early merchant capitalism is an implement that cannot be reconciled with a money credit distinction, because the early Bill of Exchange is absolutely, it's not just a form of credit, it's a derivative, which is, a claim on a credit. So it's not clear to me, and I guess maybe one way of cashing this out, it's not clear to me that we can reconcile claims to the money credit distinction, or that we say as Marxists, as readers of Marx, should be seeking to kind of hold a line on here's substantive value we can point to or hold in our hand. This points to the fictitious capital discussion, which again is a concept Marx gets from somebody else. He uses it loosely in manuscripts, and I don't think it's ultimately defendable. It makes for a very tidy argument when we want to critique the chaos and explosion and destruction of our contemporary capitalism, that it's all this fictitious capital expanding. But I think there is a nature of value under capitalism that Marx helped us see that is a prospective, projected future value. Value under capitalism is this thing where the capitalist says, I will start a production process on the promise of the future realization of value. And I will get some credits from the banker to employ labor and buy materials to generate surplus value that I realize for value. So I think if we're reading Marx as a value theory, holding on to an idea that, no, this is substantive value and that's fiction, I don't think that will ultimately work. And I also worry in very concrete terms that, like, you get to claims like a narrow bank, like what Phil was suggesting earlier, right? We'll sort this out by just having real money in the bank. But I think we see historically and conceptually that money can expand and contract as credits are issued and destroyed, that it is this relation between entities where there's a swap of IOUs, and that is the form that we are realizing value under capitalism. And so we need to think about banking a whole lot more. We need to think about derivatives a whole lot more. And the response to how we would regulate or critique or alter or abolish capitalism can't assume that away, because I think that function is at the heart of a capitalist social order.
Anybody want to respond?
I'll say something, and I think it. I take it to reinforce something you said, Bev, about and maybe it's something of a pushback on what you're saying there, Sam, and that is the idea of there has to be social validation. It seems to me that the idea of the universal equivalent form in that polarity of the value form, the expression of value, it seems to me that that's that the universal equivalent idea really bears on the idea that you have to have a form of social validation in a capitalist society where production is independently undertaken, and you don't know how do you get that social validation, and the answer is being sold. But is it critical? I think that the thrust of the equivalent form and that polarity is that to make that really work, and therefore make this kind of combined system of production and exchange work, whatever's in the equivalent form, we call it money, has to be liquid in your terminology. It has to be right. I mean, this is part of the whole description of the equivalent form, right? Is the contrast between the equivalent form and the relative form. It seems to me like so. I wonder if that's not really, a critical part, a critical feature here, that that we have that universal equivalent form, just in terms of the coherence of the system ultimately.
I mean, it's too simple, but I think that money credit through a system of bank money and banking regulations and the hierarchy of money, as Merlin describes it, is the universal equivalent. It is the necessary form that value takes under capitalism. That when we want to realize the value of our commodities, whether we've gone through a capitalist production process or we've got extra stuff we want to sell, we want the money form. And the money form can take a lot of different shapes and sizes, but in our society today and historically, it has taken various forms of money credit. And depending on where we are and what we want to do, the money credit that we might want would be different. Because I think that's like the universal equivalent it's not like there's some single thing there, linen or gold. It's the money form is the universal equivalent. And if you're borrowing some money from your friend or your family, it might take the form of literally an IOU. If you're Jeff Bezos trying to put his money credits in a stable form, he's buying U.S. government bonds. So it can vary quite a bit. But I think that Marx's overall picture is right to say that that's the universally equivalent, in that is the way we take things that are not money, commodities, and realize their value in the money form of value. I was going to say earlier, but I didn't finish. There's also the idea that if you have all these money credits, is that really the realization of value? I think there's a different side to the realization of value, which is that if your money's sitting in the bank, it's not actually doing anything. You should buy food, clothing, or shelter, or fund things with it. Consume those goods and services, and that in some ways the realization of value is the consumption of the commodity, which is itself the destruction of its use value. And so you ultimately get the only way you could truly realize value is to destroy it. But I recognize that the main understanding of realization of value is the culmination of the production process in M prime. But I just think that takes the form of money credits. It doesn't take the form of capitalists storing up things of intrinsic value or things with use value. It is this exchange value become independent, and exchange value can only become independent if it's not tethered. I mean, this is the difference with a commodity. The exchange value in a commodity, all commodities are exchange values, but their exchange value is tethered to the physical body where the use value is. Money is exchange value become independent. It's just zeros and ones on a spreadsheet.
Should I jump in? I'm just...
Yes, please jump in. I mean, it's such a good discussion. I really just want to listen. So,
I agree with Sam, the point you made about merchant capital and that history of the emergence. We agree there. And I don't want to go there, but funnily enough, I totally agree with you about barter. That is a modern. I have. Yeah, I'm going to try spinning out something like that. But the idea that barter is actually a modern expression and opposed something that only emerges with capitalism as a logic, not as an ontology, but as a logic. But okay, one of the reasons, one of the problems we don't on the rest of it, we don't really agree. I think at this, no, I don't think we don't. But you're right. Like all the questions, both Sam and Philip too. You're right. This is about thinking about what people actually do and how this works and connecting up what's happening on the surface of things and in everyday life back to some kind of internal mechanisms or dynamics that can make sense of how that works and link that up to the kind of a more empirical expression of what's going on. The reason why I think, though, that a theory of money, a theory of capitalist money, or a theory of money and capitalism has to be a theory of the system tout court is because Marx was trying to understand how, for example, why exchange value cannot just be independent. Yes, on the surface of things, exchange value becomes the independent form of money, but he says that's just the appearance. It can't become independent because there's no way, without understanding the way in which all prices, and I'm not talking about value and exchange value, prices, which is, yes, value, but also not value. Prices are the monetary expression of value that never sync up with value, or if they do, with the value of any commodity, or if they do, only accidentally. But the reason why Marx said that it comes back to values because exchange value is tied to value in the sense that it explains what he sometimes otherwise calls the astrology of prices. Prices are not just random. I can't, let's say I was a manufacturer, a producer of something, and I make a widget and I put it on the market. I can pretend to myself that it's up to me what kind of price tag I put on it. But what happens when I put a price tag on it that's too high? That's so much higher than its value that maybe I get away with selling that widget once, maybe twice. But eventually one of two things happen. Eventually, I either go out of business because I can't keep selling that widget so much higher with the price tag that's so much higher than its value, because my competitors who are making similar things will put me out of business. Or the other thing that can happen is that I'm putting a price tag on that's much too low, and that price tag now no longer allows me to make a sufficient amount of profit off of my production process. So I'm going to go to business one way or another. So what value is for Marx is this invisible thermostat, this system of regulating price that's invisible, that happens behind the backs of everyone that's producing anything, that says, just try to put the price tag of your widget so far above its value, or just try to put the price tag of your widget down systematically down below its value. Value, the price and value are connected. They have to come apart, because the process of equalization that makes capital possible is something to A, emerge, and B, to reproduce itself has to take place. And that can only take place when price comes apart from value. But it's elastic and it can only go so far. And if you pull price too far beyond its value and that elastic band snaps, you're out of business. And if that's happening randomly, Marx is trying to say value is, and I tried to think through one of the reasons why your book for me was so incredibly helpful to read, and for my own project and what I'm trying to do, is because I was trying to think through the reality, a potential reality of credit money, thinking, okay, there's no, when I tried to think about, a money that is not connected to value, or that is not an expression of an objective, a determinate magnitude of socially necessary labor time. And I tried to think, okay, what happens if I'm not regular that? Just the sheer fact of how capital has to work as a system to reproduce snapped me right back into the mechanism that Marx calls money. It is if to say, it's not, we can call it whatever we like and we can theorize it however we like, but the actual needs of capital as a machine reproducing itself posits exactly what Marx is calling money. And that is a surface appearance of value as the internal thermostat that you cannot, as a manufacturer, get away from ultimately. And that the entire system is then organized around this kind of invisible thermostat. When the social product is also at the same time takes the form of private property, right? So Marx is denaturalizing the system, and I want to come back, Sam, I'm coming back to your important, super important paragraph at the very
Can I just say really quickly there, because I think it's so important. Money under capitalism is totally connected to value, absolutely. And I think that you're looking at the price value uncoming apart and coming back together. It's absolutely the case that producers and consumers are both price takers. Marx knows this. This is actually one of the things that neoclassical economics knows too. But that's absolutely true. You don't establish value by putting a price tag on something, and Marx does great work with that. But my theory of money does not in any way disconnect money from the theory of value. Money is the necessary form that value takes. So I guess my wariness would be at thinking the idea that when we refuse a rigid money credit distinction, which is not to refuse any distinction. The book belabors this point, but some credits don't circulate. Phil mentioned Minsky's point. I can write an IOU and offer it to Patrick and he can say, go away. Or I can give him the IOU and he can offer it to you, Bev, and you say, I don't want to claim on him. Have you read his book? No way. Can't trust that guy as a debtor. So there is a distinction between money and credit in that practically and concretely credits don't circulate. Ontologically, we cannot draw the strong line. That is we won't know until the prospective future. But to say everything I say about the claims about money, I want to situate that in the context of a capitalist social order that is the self-valorization of value, which means that when money is still the necessary form of value, it's just that I think the necessary form that value must take is money credits, claims on debtors, not it must take the form. And I think this is consistent with Marx, because I don't think it's really tenable within Marx's system to think that the realization of value would be getting rid of your commodities for another commodity. But the fact that we displace the universal equivalent, that we set it aside in Form D, and this is what he says in the Urtext and the Grundrisse, once it's functioning as money, it's not functioning as a commodity at all. But I'm sorry, Bev, I interrupted there.
Just a word on that last. Oh, did you want?
No, go ahead, Patrick.
Just to follow up on that, yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think that I get that out of capital though too. In other words, that with gold is functioning as money, it's not a commodity. It's not a commodity. And so I early on in the book when you say never, It's never, even if you're even go there. Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's I think that's in capital. I mean, I get that in capital. You're quoting Grundrisse or Urtext, and yeah, fine. But I take that to be Marx. But
I get it in capital too. But one of the reasons I get it in capital too is as I learned how to read capital from you, and if we have a truly social theory of labor, then we understand value in that way. So one of the reasons I point to other places, and especially in dialogue with Bev, is I think there is a reading of Marx in Capital where the universal equivalent is money. Gold is money. He says that. Fictitious capital means that we have to distinguish between money and credit. And if one wants to develop a theory of money in Marx, you have to do something with those things. You can build them out and have a relatively orthodox classical political economy theory of money as commodity money, linked up with Marx's theory of value, production, surplus value, etc. But I think we know that orthodox commodity theory of money is false. And the reason I point to other places is that I think that when we read Marx in the Urtext and the Grundrisse, even when we read him in Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, he's got these insights where he's seeing that won't work. And this is too simplistic and maybe slightly unfair. I can't justify it here, but I think there is, we know how Volume 1 gets rewritten over the editions in the years. Engels pushing to make it a kind of clearer explanation. It becomes a bit more linear. And I think that it lends itself to the reading of value that is not your reading, Patrick. And when you throw money in there and you're like, money is gold is a commodity of substantial use value, then you just get a whole different Marx out of that. So this is kind of coming at a different angle. Bev's obviously not reading it in that simplistic, reductive way at all, but I'm pointing to some of those other things to figure out how you kind of use those things. When you say gold has never been a commodity, but you still see the importance of the universal equivalent, that's what I want to get at as well. But I think a lot of people see the universal equivalent and they think that's Marx's name for commodity money.
No. If I could say something to your response earlier, Sam, about credit, on this question of the universal equivalent. I mean, what about this possibility? And this is another side of what I suggested before, by way of not getting rid of the credit money distinction, is that something just stops being money. I mean, that this happens. What if we just said we don't have money? We don't have, in other words, this is what the kind of things you're pointing. I'm also thinking about your the whole question of money markets. I mean, I always think that's an oh wow movement. If you ask students like what is bought and sold the most every day of the year, and nobody says what's the correct answer, which is money, which is weird. Okay, and that makes me wonder. If you say world money, right? I'm thinking of world money at the end of chapter 3. I mean, what's the denomination for world money? Put it that way.
Can I tap in here for Sam? I think your concept of money space is a really useful space, particularly the way you use it to describe the fall of Bretton Woods order, by saying essentially, look, it's not a national space, the money space of the dollar. What happened is it included Eurodollars and petrodollars that were essentially made through production outside of America. And so many New York firms would store their money out there in London and so forth, that Regulation Q, for example, which put a limit on interest rates that could be charged in the US, that eventually fell apart as did capital controls. So you have a dialectic of money spaces kind of working there. And that's a mid-range concept, we would call it, that helps us explain the kind of empirical story of what happened in the transition from, let's say, capital controls to where we are now, and
so much of what we have now, the swap is invented to get over capital controls in the last half of the 20th century, and its logic expands and trends in amazing ways. But Patrick, to your point, I think that's gold as world money. That's one of these places where, again, my point is to try to develop a theory of money that I think we can fold back into Marx's theory of capitalism, because there isn't a better theory or critique of capitalism. So I don't have some alternative place to go to. But gold as world money, Marx says quite clearly, and that's false. I just think that's wrong. Gold was not world money in the 19th century. The world money was British pounds. And in the 20th century, it became US dollars. And it became bank accounts denominated in British pounds, money credits denominated in British pounds, then money credits denominated in US dollars. People talked about a gold standard. They talked about being able to exchange these money credits for gold. They never did it except for when it had to be done, at which point they changed the law and said you can't do it. They put a lot in their banks because one of the things you want your bank to be is solvent. And once you get to the level of a central bank, when you're at a commercial bank, they can be solvent because they can say, I've got lots of credits on the central bank. But when you get up to the central bank, the outside of money is always going to be something that's not money. So at the central bank, they have other claims, and they pile a bunch of gold in there because they say, see, we're rich, we have gold. They also pile up a bunch of claims on other central banks. Or at a certain point, if you're looking at the US Fed, they say, well, what's our asset? Well, we're linked to the US Treasury, which is linked to the US government, which has a massive military and a massive taxation capacity with police force. So our credits are good because we will force people to work or invade other countries or whatever else it takes, right? There's a certain outside of money. And it is true that in the 19th century, we have a gold standard. So there's an ultimate outside of money that is gold. And every now and then they put some gold bars on a ship and sent them other places. But whenever that was happening, they became desperate very quickly and stopped doing it. So, I'm reading right now a great book on Lend-Lease. And in 1941, Britain is shipping gold bars to the US, but they're going to run out really quickly. So what do? We inflate the balance sheet and create a whole lot of credits. We're still going to keep making planes and sending them to England. And, that's not fictitious at all. That's as concrete as we can imagine.
Well, I think we're running out of time now. This discussion, like Samuel's book, could actually have gone on for another 200 pages. Bev, are you writing? Yes, Money Has No Value. It's a terrific book. And your next book, Bev, is about money, the theory of money.
I was just going to say, operator standing by.
Okay. Well, we have your book on money here. We'll have Samuel up there to bring. Patrick, thanks a lot. I'm really looking forward to the book about recognizing capital. I think that's a genius phrase. It sort of implies that most people don't.
That would be the point. Yeah, that's it. That's it. And that's a big, that to me is the commentary. Marx says essentially capital is the central reality and the central concept, and most all of social theory is trying to do without it.
That is indeed a truth universally acknowledged. Even more than Jane Austen's truth. But hey, I'm going to do you guys can pretend to be operators for a second. We love doing Red May. We have no institutional support. We depend on you, the kindness of strangers. You can go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and donate there. You can become a member of our Patreon, or you can go to www.GoFundMe. I think it's www. Anyway, GoFundMe.com. Take a break from capitalism. That's us. You can give us large chunks of money. We want to do this forever and ever until we run out of credit or money or whatever the fuck it is. I don't know. At any rate, thank you, Bev Vest, Sam, and Patrick Murray. And I should say that tomorrow we have at 5 p.m. we're premiering our Red May News Jam, our news hour. The subject is 1, 2, 3, many Columbias. We'll have reports from encampments all around the country, we hope. And we'll see where all that's going. And also on June 1st, we are presenting live Bev's current book, which is The Automatic Fetish from Verso. And that will be at 1 p.m. on June 1st. So check out our website for the schedule. Thank you for watching, and everybody, wherever you are, enjoy the weather. I hope you can.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you all.